Ladies and gentlemen, and all my unicorns with a thirst for blood, today I'm covering V Rising, an early access game by indie developer Stunlock Studios, with their take on the survival genre by adding in vampires. I must admit, the only survival game I have played previously was Valheim, and there are many similarities as both are within the same genre, but I feel V Rising is a much better product overall, with a greater emphasis on your home base, greater selection of combat abilities, and dozens of bosses which progress in difficulty. The basic premise is that the vampires ruled the night until the humans grew in power and overthrew them, and now you must seek out revenge for your kind and conquer. Rise, tarnished. Rise, vampire. I start the game on a solo server, so I can experience the game at my own pace, but you can choose to group up with others or PvP, which adds a lot of nuance to the game. This first impressions will not only cover these aspects, but the solo experience. But this in itself is a great addition to the game. You have multiple options on how you wish to play before the game even begins. As we leave the crypts, we enter the tutorial section. What I like about this section is that it progressively teaches us mechanics from the game and immediately puts them to good use, as a good tutorial should. The tutorial also is set in the game world, but we train in a relatively safe environment. We learn how to use crafting, and the game tasks us to slay skeletal enemies until we build up our own bone sword. Crafting is central to survival games, so teaching us the importance of this the moment we begin the game is a fantastic touch. It then tasks us to craft a bone ring and slay enemies with our projectile ability Shadowbolt, allowing us to get used to both the melee and ranged combat systems the game has to offer. We simply aim the Shadowbolt in the direction we want to fire, and voila! This further delivers on how important positioning will be in the game. Obviously, this will open us up to a large variety of abilities later on to test out. I also have a travel ability, which is useful for dodging mechanics, and this will matter a lot in this game. This ability can be changed as we progress, just like the other abilities as well. This tutorial is progressively adding layers that the game has to offer, and a little mission text in the upper left hand corner will provide us with an idea what we should be aiming towards as we progress throughout the game. Now the game tasks us to finish off crafting multiple new items and adds in new materials for us to collect, forcing us to venture out of the safety of the graveyard to newer pastures. I also learned that I stayed too long in the starting area and I ran out of blood, which forced me to take continual damage until I found blood to drink. However, therein lies the issue. These skeletons and ghouls do not have blood, so I need to figure out a way to find blood, and at the same time the game teaches me about the healing in combat and outside of combat, now that my health has triggered this pop-up. Now that I have reached the gate, I have technically left the tutorial area, but I am in no way finished the tutorial quests. That is when I discover that the game did offer me a means to treat my blood loss. I can actually devour these rats I have found as I smashed my way through the very beginning area. This provides me with just enough sustenance to stave off my thirst for a little while and allow my health regeneration to continue again. Hurrah! Jolly good vampire! A little outside the graveyard, I officially step out into the starting region of Farbane Woods and come across a wolf, and it lunges at me. And it's at this point, as I whittled down its health, it gave me a feed option and a percentage next to it. I choose to do just that, and I noticed my blood in the bottom center of the screen on the UI filled up. So now I learned what I must do when my blood gets low. Feed, like any vampire would. I then discovered that the percentage quality of blood from creatures can give me a buff, and different enemy types can give different buffs. This will have a large impact in the game as we progress, particularly when conquering enemy territories like strongholds and bosses. The upper right hand corner is dedicated to my in-game minimap, but more vitally important, it's the time of day. At nighttime, I can freely roam the world with a sense of peace. However, during the day, I am virtually against the clock. I can burn from the intense sunlight. This is amazing, yet also fear-inducing and an annoying mechanic all at the same time. Vampires hate sunlight, as we know, so if we remain for a few seconds outside of the safety of the shadows during the daytime, we will be caught in the sun's rays and fry, taking increased damage every second until we die. This adds an extra dimension to the immersion of the exploration the game delivers, and as we know, we must always be extra careful of our footing and seek out shadows from structures, trees, inside buildings, etc., as we slowly make sense of this world. Naturally, we could just hold out till darkness if that suited you, but you would be giving up a lot of time. But hey, each to their own. Now, while I was adventuring from the starting point, I was already hacking down a lot of trees and lumber and rocks for stone and grass for plant fibers, just because I knew from Valheim I needed resources in this game. But the quest after I was fully equipped with my new bone armor and weapons encouraged me to start cutting down lumber. So although the technical tutorial zone has ended, I am still being led and encouraged through the missions on what I need to do next, teaching me, a new player, on how to survive in this world where everyone wants you dead. I scoured the starting region, taking down enemies higher in power than me, and watching how the blood mechanic works, all while trying to find a suitable place to construct my castle so I have a safe haven. On the top of your character, next to your health, you will have a number, and this is your gear level, and the higher your gear level, the more powerful you are, the further you can explore and the bosses you can take on. When you're lower than the enemy, their name can appear in yellow, where they are suitable for you to kill. Red means they're a bit more powerful than you, or skull means they are much more powerful. On the video right now, I wander aimlessly across a treant, which sprouts from the ground and has a skull on its name, so I ran the hell out of there. When an enemy is much more powerful than you, they take reduced damage from your ability, so the game uses this as a soft guide to guide you. I find a sizable area on the top of a hill with ruined walls, almost as if the game was begging for me to establish my castle here. First, you need a castle heart and feed it before it decays entirely and your castle is destroyed. A very simple process to remain aloft once you head out into the game world and start killing living creatures which hold essences, which are needed to not only establish the foundations of your base, but to keep its heart beating. Around this time, I found myself slowly throwing together some beginning structures while gaining resources and staying out of the pesky sunlight. I started to establish my perimeter by laying foundations of wooden walls and shortly constructing a sawmill to refine my wood into planks, and a workbench to eventually craft stronger gear, which ultimately will increase my gear level from the 10 you see on the screen. Crafting as we continue will require new structures and resources further and further away, encouraging you to go out into the game world and explore the greater regions. But many of these crafting stations are locked away behind one of the central mechanics the game has to offer, which I'll delve into next. After a bit more labour, I crafted enough gear to begin working towards the Blood Altar, which plays a crucial role in the game whereby it lists bosses known as V-Blood Carriers, close to your current gear level. Typically, the list you will see will most likely be the list you will use to suck your way through each of these bosses in order, with the odd deviation here and there. Typically, you will want to start by tracking one V-Blood carrier at a time, and the altar will send you their location with a red haze effect appearing in the direction of the boss. One thing I have noticed is once you reach and interact with the boss, the haze indicator disappears until you return to the altar, which can be annoying later on, particularly when some bosses patrol large routes on the map. Maybe this will be changed in a patch. After tackling through various creatures and poachers in the forest thus far, I find myself face to face with the first boss of the game, the Alpha Wolf. So let's have a look at how the first boss handles its combat. I hear bosses progressively become more problematic as time goes on, and the boss is simply lunging at me and trying to bite me, but once he reaches a certain health threshold, he howls and calls forth two wolves to assist him. He behaves quite similar to other wolves, with just a lot more health, and once I reduce his health part to 0, I get a notice to feed on the alpha wolf, and he just stays there in a trance of some sort. I'm not sure how long this lasts, but I'd rather not find out, so I immediately jump on the wolf and begin sucking the V-blood out of him. I get told I have gained a new vampire power thanks to this V-blood, and what's this? I can now change my form into a wolf? That's pretty cool. Thanks to the wolf form, and other forms I'll undoubtedly obtain throughout the game, I'll be able to change up the gameplay a bit more. The wolf form effectively allows me to travel faster than I could just running, so it's a nifty little speed boost that I'll need to reactivate every time I get out of wolf form, which is when I want to attack something or harvest something. And this begins the game loop. Go to the altar, hunt the boss, return to the castle, and do any necessary crafting and storing of items and accept the next boss target. Okay, that seems like a fun treadmill at least. Especially knowing there's dozens of bosses ahead and an even greater world. As of right now, there are 37 bosses to encounter, with more locations and bosses planned in the future. That should be plenty to keep me occupied, right? At the same time, I'm noticing each boss will grant me either a new ability or unlocking something by crafting, which further cements how important they are to the overall progression, gating off progression, behind chasing after these elusive foes. I finally craft the research desk and it shows me that I can find patterns out in the world to further enhance my castle with features or augment my character with potions or the ability to craft gear, so I could potentially be held back on my adventures with waiting for a new pattern to drop. But there seems to be a bit of a random pity system added, whereby if I add 50 pieces of paper which I can come across on my adventures, I can come back to the research desk and obtain a random not yet discovered pattern. So grinding could play a role, but hopefully these patterns won't be too much of a pain in the ass to find, especially if they contain some vital upgrades to help me in my fight for dominance. And as sure as night will fade into day, it appears I don't have enough cover just yet in my slowly expanding necropolis, as I have not yet figured out how to gain ceilings. So I find myself hiding in the little bits of shade that I can and planning my next building moves. But the game throws you a solution with a mist brazier, which I can throw in bones into it and it forms a cloud which blocks out the sun in an area. Inventory management is another feature in this game, and although it provides you with enough storage space back in your castle and all the chests you will create for all your collectibles, I found my inventory space, the one in which I carry, a nuisance when out on longer expeditions. So this cleverly gets the player to think ahead before you act, and that's what I advise, especially as you progress. Carry as little as you need to bring on your adventure, and have a plan of action on each journey. Whether it's to fight a certain boss and loot nearby areas, or if you're out looking for a specific resource or resources, make targeted goals and inventory management will be less of a hindrance. And since inventory management is such a large deal, as it directly influences crafting due to resources, it is best to be organized and put items in storage groups. I eventually found myself having chests for ores, a chest for flowers, etc. I know to progress further, I need to be on the lookout for copper ore found in copper veins throughout the region. Luckily on my adventure, I found a specific area known as the copper mines, which had bountiful supplies of this resource, but naturally was well defended. And this is where my previous advice started to come from. You will make targeted journeys back and forth trying to gather as much vital resources you need to aid your progression. And shortly after, I found myself working on my next progression equipment of the plated bone guard armor and copper weapons, so I knew I needed to do a few targeted assaults while on the lookout for patterns, bosses, as I gained the power I needed to tackle greater foes. This game is more of a marathon than a sprint, and at times it may feel too much, but break it down into personal goals and it won't be so complicated on what to focus next. On my copper farming run, I keep ahead of the game. I found that I picked up some silver for the first time, and I got a giant warning that I'm carrying such. What I noticed is that it's a debuff, and the more silver I obtain, the more it will burn me, which is when I remembered vampires were weak to silver. So the game incorporated another bit of vampire lore into the game. I had no idea what silver was used for at the time, but if I picked up too much, I will start to be damaged, and the more I picked up, the more this damage would be. The annoying thing about these debuffs is that you cannot stay in your transformed self, like the wolf form, if you take damage. You cannot heal yourself through mending, as it's a channeled ability, so healing becomes a tougher ordeal. You could simply drop the silver if it becomes burdensome, however. Hot on the trail of the next boss in the copper mines, I find he has a frontal exploding ability, calls in minions, and has a whirlwind cleave ability if I get too close, but also is quite slow with moves. As he gets lower, something I start to notice in bosses as he goes into a second phase, where normally he empowers an ability or adds something new to his arsenal. I typically like this in games, so the encounter is not the same from start to finish once you see what abilities they have. With the V-blood sucked out of him, I acquire a new ability. Another thing I noticed is that when you gain an ability, it is inspired from the boss and usually is similar to a mechanic the boss had, which makes a lot of sense considering you're empowered by the very blood you drained from said boss. With a trip back to her castle, we go out and search for a logging section full of humans, so I took it upon myself to clear it out and give myself enough room to tackle the next boss, Rufus the Foreman, and trying out my new shockwave ability at the same time. I like that you can chop and change abilities so quickly, but the travel dodge ability and the shadow bolt in particular will be staple of mine, as I find these most useful so far and much further into the game. Rufus likes to call on support like previous bosses before him, tries to trap you in nets, fires from his gun, sometimes from a single to multiple rounds, but nothing too difficult, and along the same lines as Errol before him. At this time, I found myself upgrading my bone weapons to copper and getting a little damage boost and gear level at the same time. Each weapon you craft has its own unique primary attack, but what I noticed is once I upgraded to copper, the weapon gained a new ability, and I see there is a room for a third. So eventually a further upgrade will unlock a third ability for each weapon once I upgrade them. This progressively changes up the combat, and since you can change weapons on the fly, you can swap through weapon techniques very quickly. Layers upon layers. You just gotta love it. Each weapon also helps with harvesting a certain resource, so it is encouraged to go out and explore with multiple weapons, and I'm sure more will unlock in the future. So now I found myself transforming copper into ignites and upgrading myself while attending to the castle or doing little expeditions while I waited for those materials to be produced. Or I could just step away from the game for a few minutes at a time, as long as I was in a safe space from the sun, or go to sleep and wait in my crypt. All the countdowns in this game are based on real-time gameplay, so if I log off and go to work and come back later, they will not progress. This isn't your typical mobile-style game. This will become more burdensome later on with other systems, but nothing to worry about yet. At this time it was late enough, and almost after 2.5 hours of gameplay I decided to call it quits for the night, and the moment I could, the following day I logged back in and was ready to go on the hunt again and gather more content for this first impressions. I felt I needed more, like I was barely scratching the surface of what this game had to offer. Oh, little did I know. Starting off the day, I shortly came up against Lydia the Chaos Archer, who proved to be a lot more nimble than the bosses before her. Once I found her, the sun came out, and this opened up the bosses to be a lot more difficult, with even more thought process added into the mix, as boss abilities could break some of the cover you are using to avoid the sun. Not only are you dodging the boss's abilities, but you need to be mindful of your sun positioning, which adds extra complexity and essentially opens a hard mode, so to speak, to these already formidable foes. Lydia shows us another chaos effect which burns us for a few seconds if we get touched. She mostly relies on vanishing, throwing chaos bombs, and trying to destroy you with barrages of arrows. So the game is teaching us even more on how positioning is important. Patrolling bosses such as Lydia can be a nuisance in that their leashing can be quite strange. Venture too far from where you're fighting and they will reset. Some bosses later on I found to be quite particularly frustrating because it was never really clear on how far you can go from when the boss battle began. Maybe some sort of warning could appear on the UI if we're going too far. With Lydia down, I can try out her new Chaos Barrage ability, which hurls multiple Chaos Bolts at the target. I do find myself staying in range more often than not, as it makes a lot of these encounters a lot more tolerable, hence keeping my staple Shadow Bolt in my arsenal. Making my way to the far western side of the map, I come into a large settlement of a new sulphur resource, where the next boss, Clive, prances around the battlefield with bombs and large area of effect attacks taking centre stage. Around the same lines of difficulty as Lydia, this is the first boss I noticed the leashing mechanic being most troublesome, as I never felt I lured him far enough to warrant him resetting, but I had to restart the fight multiple times due to this. With Clive's V-blood in my veins and a full inventory, I venture back to my castle. It's at this point I really start to notice the amount of running back and forth this game has, and it will become a lot more troublesome as I progress further away from my castle later in the game. But the game does eventually provide us with shortcuts and teleportation, but under strict circumstances. The majority of bosses in this game are humanoids, however every so often we change it up by taking on powerful creatures. The first boss was a wolf, and a later boss in the starting region is a bear. By this time I have fought plenty of bears in the wild, so this boss shares multiple shared abilities, with some enhancements such as a lot of ground effects. The cool thing about this boss is he unlocks our presumably second form, the bear. Although I rarely found the bear useful, it can provide some nice regeneration at times and extra resistance which can help in some later areas when Holy Radiance comes into play. Then we have bosses which can be very different with a lot of magical spells and provide some very different mechanics. The point is, spread over this game's 37 bosses, we have a wide variety of them, so the encounter format never grows too stale. Now, although I'm not showcasing every boss this game has to offer, I'm showcasing specific bosses. Typically the final boss you will face in the starting region will be in the Bandit Stronghold against Quincy, the Bandit King, and ultimately that's where I was going to end my first impressions video. But before I decided to take him on, I finally got my castle to a much nicer state with stone walls and floors, which combined creates an automatic roof to block out the sun on each room where both the aforementioned are accomplished. Crafting stations can gain a 25% reduction in time taken to make things if they are in rooms, and a further 25% reduction in the cost if floor tiles match what the crafting station needs. This adds a bit more complexity to how you set up your castle, as you will be undoubtedly be wanting these bonuses, especially when new materials will be rare in the beginning and crafting items for the first time. It is extra nice knowing you're making them at reduced cost. However, you may not have found the floor pattern required for the reduction just yet, which is something which hampered me every so often as you're battling the RNG gods. Around this time I've also built a teleportation hub from my castle. Throughout the starting zone I had come across a few vampire gateways which provided me with shortcuts to get around the map faster, and even better I can now teleport to and from my castle. However, there is a major and annoying yet understandable condition here, in that you can only use these devices provided you are not carrying any resources, and the majority of items in the game are a resource. Generally these will be most useful when you want to cut out a lot of running portion of the adventure outwards to your next destination, but most likely you will need to return by running to your castle no matter where you are on the map. I also found a few caves dotted in the starting zone, but I could not yet access them, and they are used in the late game as additional shortcuts, but generally will be used on the return from adventures. I figured that the stronghold boss would typically be the final boss of the zone, even if he is sooner than another boss on the list. He easily gates access to two important structures to prepare your next major gear level with iron weapons and armor, and the recipes to convert iron ore into ignites. Although not required to progress to the mid-game area of Dunley Farmlands, you would soon find yourself massively out-leveled without the rewards that Quincy has to offer. Quincy is held in a large stronghold and will take every aspect you have learned thus far to conquer, and finally you will be able to finish the starting journey with a gear level around 39. The boss's charging skills, a rebounding shield which can rebound your magic abilities, has shockwave abilities to dodge too and can summon assistance. Watching for his tells will be the only way you'll bring down this adversary. This boss nicely sums up the progression of boss difficulty to this point throughout the Farbane Woods. And that is where I was supposed to stop playing, supposed to make this first impressions video. of approximately the last 7 or so hours of gameplay. But like an addiction, I refused to stop playing. I was so gripped by this game and immediately went through the Dunley farmlands, which took me to gear level 57, and found myself against the end boss in a stronghold similar to Quincy, who guarded some vital upgrades before I could proceed into the late game areas of the Cursed Woods and Silverlight Hills, with the odd detour here and there to Hollowed Mountain, which only had 2 bosses in it and no enemies, a seemingly either rush zone or not fully fleshed out zone, and later to be greatly expanded upon, with the area shrouded just north of it. Octavian, the militia captain, was a brutal fight for me, requiring quite a long time before I finally could take him down, as his encounter was quite tough. Breaking past this barrier, I slowly made my way through the much tougher environment of the Cursed Wood and lurking werewolves in the shadows which sneak up upon you as you travelled, and higher level than you, might I add, to add to their pain. This is where the game slowed down considerably for me, but this is the late game. At this point in the early access, gear upgrades are typically stuck behind needing to kill certain bosses to craft certain crafting stations, so it feels like you could come to a wall. So I ping-ponged between bosses split in both late game zones, finding which was easier for me to take out where possible. All this back and forth and slowly amassing resources added many hours of gameplay until I eventually felt confident in taking out the Spider Queen, whom resides deep within the Spider Caverns. So getting back to your corpse before everything respawns can be quite annoying, as there is only one waypoint in both of these zones. And I am far from my castle at this point, so I can easily teleport there, but getting back requires minutes of running in wolf form, or else even potentially on a horse, which you can find in the Dunley Farms area. Getting back to your corpse before everything respawns in certain dungeons, such as the Spider Cavern, can be quite annoying, but great at amassing materials you will need. Eventually taking out this boss and multiple others to finally get access to the late game armor and weapons, I could begin to take on more and more challenges and clear these areas with ease. Even if bosses pose lethal threats, and there are some nasty bosses in these zones, including Styx, a patrolling boss, which my greatest issue with him was his resetting due to his leashing and werewolves joining the fight as he patrols the routes too. Around this time, I became more aware of the prison system, where I can capture an enemy in the world, preferably with a blood quality close to 100% or even 100%, and bring it back to prison to always have that blood available to me. But I had to make sure I balanced how much blood I sucked, as too much can cause the prisoner to die, with the misery mechanic stacking up after every bite. These can be reset by feeding the prisoner with fish primarily, which brings fishing into the game experience more so, or finding fish as you adventure. Admittedly, I never like fishing in any game, and it wasn't until the very end of the game I decided to give it a go. My advice is that it's very simple to do, and do it as you're running from point A to B, as it seemed to not only be a decent way to get fish, but even patterns and other resources, and each fishing spot only takes about 10 or so seconds to do. But it's 10 seconds of annoyance for me, which I find quite odd. I have less problems running back multiple minutes to my castle, but standing still for about 10 seconds irritates me. Each to their own, I suppose. Also, to help with the running back and forth, I suggest YouTube on your second screen, or at least music, then it's never too bad. Also in the end game, I started capturing a few servants, a mechanic we learned early, but I never had decent gear to give them, to have them hunt for me, and the waiting mechanic of potentially several hours, including injuries, can set them back afterwards, and it's just a little bit too long for my liking, and possibly something the developers could look into going forward. And to make my first impressions, Even more not of first impressions, I eventually got to take on the late game bosses which offered more abilities, crafting options and forms, such as the currently useless frog form and the excellent bat form, which allows you to fly over the map at nighttime with the same restrictions as teleporters have, aka no resources being held. Once again, I understand why this is here, but how overpowered would this form be if you could? I want to take a quick moment to mention the cave system, as you can travel in seconds from one part of the map to another connecting cave. The problem currently is that it's really only one way. I really hoped the frog form would help with this, and I was convinced that was why we got it in the first place. You see, each cave in the early to mid game is high up and cannot be reached, so this would be a sensible way to use the frog form to leap onto these platforms, but sadly it cannot. This would vastly reduce the running time in the late game, as your castle will be very far away. I did end up constructing a second mini castle in the western side of the Silverlight Hills, near the silver mine, but it was more so for respawning purposes and holding onto items, some prisoners, and faster teleportation. You can only have 2 castles at a time. Finally, in this first impressions, the end game final 3 bosses, which each held a shard to be constructed back in your castle. Each of these shards give resistance buffs and some combat utility for 2 hours at a time, and you only need to click on each one of these to reapply the buff. Stacking these with other consumables such as resistance potions or power increase brews and your blood quality and type is practically mandatory for the late game bosses. The former, of course, which would not be available until you take down the 3 end game bosses that the game has to offer to this point in the early access. I will run through these feisty 3 bosses which test everything you have learned to this point, with only one I had issues on in another video. I also plan to supplement these videos with a more in-depth look to the prisoner and servant system along with farming locations, but for now, this first impressions, which really was only done after finishing the game it seems, just goes to show how addictive and enjoyable experience I had found this. So take trial and error with abilities and learn each boss's mechanics and find suitable routes and areas to farm by breaking down your travel into meaningful goals, and soon, vampire, you will rise. Thank you very much for watching, ladies and gentlemen, and all my vampire aspiring unicorns. Thank you for your support. If you liked the video and want to see more, then click that subscribe button and interact with the video. Thank you for watching, and in case I don't see you, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and good night. Jamie, signing out.